The winter air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and frost as Edward walked slowly through the cemetery. The ground beneath his feet was hardened by the cold, a stark contrast to the soft petals of the roses he clutched in his gloved hands. The wind howled through the bare trees, their skeletal branches stretching toward the grey sky like silent witnesses to his grief. He stopped in front of a headstone, the name carved into the stone as familiar to him as his own. He traced the letters with his fingers, his breath catching in his throat. "I brought your favorite," he murmured, placing the flowers at the base of the grave. His voice, though soft, was thick with emotion. "Another year, my love. Another year without you." Edward closed his eyes, allowing memories to wash over him. The warmth of her laughter, the way she used to tuck her hand into his arm when they walked together, the way she smelled of lavender and honey. Time had stolen her presence, but not the love he still carried. The cold began to seep into his bones, reminding him that he had been standing there longer than he realized. He exhaled heavily and turned, ready to leave. But as soon as he took a few steps, something gnawed at him. He stopped and looked around. The winding paths of the cemetery, once familiar, now looked foreign. The towering oak tree that had always marked his way back seemed to have disappeared. Panic whispered at the edges of his mind. He took another step, then another, but the more he moved, the more lost he felt. His breath quickened as he tried to recall the way he had come. Was it past the white chapel or near the iron gate? Nothing made sense. The snow began to fall in thick flakes, blurring the already confusing landscape. Edward pulled his coat tighter around himself, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. He glanced around, searching for a familiar face, but the cemetery was nearly empty. A few mourners lingered near graves, lost in their own sorrows, unaware of the elderly man standing in the cold, trapped in his own mind. He tried to focus. He had come here many times before. He had always known the way. But now, the knowledge seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. A shiver ran through him, but it wasn't just from the cold. He turned in another direction, then stopped again. Was he walking in circles? His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the pocket of his coat, hoping to find something, anything that would ground him. But his pockets were empty. He didn't remember leaving his house. He didn't remember how he had arrived, and now he had no idea how to get home. His heart pounded faster, and for the first time in years, he felt utterly helpless. The world around him had suddenly become a vast, unfamiliar place, and he was nothing more than a lost old man in a sea of forgotten paths. Then, a sound cut through the silence. A soft crunch of snow, a presence nearby. He turned sharply, expecting to see another visitor, perhaps someone who could help him, but instead he saw a dog. A large German shepherd stood a few feet away, its golden brown fur dusted with snow. Its dark eyes were locked onto him, intelligent and unwavering. It didn't bark, it didn't move, it simply watched him. Edward blinked, a strange sense of familiarity creeping into his chest. Had he seen this dog before, or was his mind playing tricks on him again? The animal took a slow step forward, then another, its gaze never leaving his. It was as if the dog knew him, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Edward felt his breath hitch. He was lost, trapped in a place where the world no longer made sense, but somehow in that moment the dog made sense. It stood there, patient, waiting. And deep down, Edward knew, this dog wasn't just passing through. It was here for him. Edward stared at the dog, his breath visible in the cold air. The German shepherd stood motionless, its dark eyes locked onto him with an unsettling intelligence. It didn't approach, nor did it retreat. It simply waited. A strange sensation settled in Edward's chest. There was something about the dog, something familiar yet impossible to place. His mind, once sharp and unyielding, now felt like a fogged mirror, full of distortions and missing pieces. The cold gnawed at him, his fingers numb even inside his gloves. He needed to find his way home. He needed to remember. The cemetery stretched around him, an endless maze of headstones and pathways that all looked the same. He turned one way, then the other, his breath growing more unsteady. Nothing made sense. A low whimper. Edward glanced back at the dog. It had taken a step forward, its paws sinking slightly into the fresh snow. The whimper came again, softer this time, almost as if it was calling him. His instinct told him to follow. He hesitated, glancing around for another option, but there was no one else. The mourners had disappeared into the distance, their figures swallowed by the thickening snowfall. The world around him was silent except for the muffled crunch of his boots against the snow as he took a hesitant step toward the dog. The shepherd's ears perked up, and without another sound, it turned and trotted ahead, its tail flicking behind it. It wanted him to follow. Edward swallowed hard, his mind a battlefield of doubt and trust. But with no other choice, he followed. They moved through the cemetery, past the towering statues of angels and weeping saints, past graves that had long been abandoned to time. Edward struggled to place landmarks, but nothing sparked recognition. The only certainty in his mind was the dog leading the way. A few minutes passed, the snowfall growing heavier. Then something strange happened. The dog suddenly stopped at a fork in the pathway, its body tense. Edward stopped too, his breath ragged. The shepherd turned its head, looking at him expectantly. It was waiting for him to decide. Edward frowned, his heart pounding harder. Did it expect him to know the way? But how could he? His own mind had betrayed him. His eyes drifted from the dog to the two paths before him. One led to an open, desolate part of the cemetery, where the trees stood like black skeletons against the pale sky. The other was narrower, winding between graves with smaller headstones, disappearing into the distance. A flicker of something, a memory, brushed against his thoughts. He knew this place. He had walked this path before. But when and why? The dog let out a small huff, its warm breath steaming in the air. It nudged its nose toward the narrower path, as if urging him. Edward's hands trembled at his sides. His mind was a locked door, but this dog had a key. Summoning what little certainty he had left, he stepped onto the narrow path. The shepherd followed immediately, keeping pace beside him, not leading now, but walking at his side. Edward exhaled shakily, feeling something shift inside him, a feeling he hadn't had in years. He wasn't alone anymore. Edward walked with cautious steps, the German shepherd beside him, the narrow path twisted between gravestones, the names etched into them worn by time. The deeper they went, the quieter the world seemed. The snowfall muffled every sound, turning the cemetery into an eerie, frozen realm where time felt suspended. He clenched his hands inside his gloves, his fingers aching from the cold. Where was this dog taking him? A flicker of memory surfaced. A cold morning. The weight of a hand in his soft laughter. Had he walked here before? His heart pounded as he struggled to grasp the fleeting thought, but like so many others, it slipped away before he could make sense of it. The frustration was unbearable. The dog picked up its pace. It wasn't pulling him, but it was determined. Edward followed, his legs unsteady, his mind a battlefield of clarity and confusion. Then, suddenly, they reached a bench. Edward stopped. His breath hitched. It was an old wooden bench, partially covered in snow, sitting beneath a large willow tree whose bare branches swayed with the wind. Something about it sent a shiver down his spine. He had been here before. He was sure of it. He reached out, brushing the snow from the seat with a trembling hand. The wood beneath was worn, the faint carvings on the armrest barely visible. He squinted, trying to make sense of the scratches. A heart, a name. The dog sat beside him, watching silently. Edward's chest tightened. A memory lurked at the edge of his consciousness. He could feel it there, just beyond his reach, like a shadow behind a frosted glass. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to focus. A woman, a beautiful woman, laughing as she carved something into the bench with a pocket knife. He could almost hear her voice, teasing him about how terrible her carving was. He had held her hand afterward, running his fingers over her initials, as if sealing a promise. His heart lurched. He had walked this path before. With her. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the bench, gripping the armrest. "I remember," he whispered, barely believing his own voice. The dog let out a low whimper, as if acknowledging his revelation. Edward turned to the shepherd, staring at it through the veil of snowflakes falling around them. "Who are you?" he murmured. The dog didn't answer, of course, but it didn't have to. Edward ran a hand down his face. His breath was ragged, the weight of emotions pressing heavily on his chest. How much more had he forgotten? How many pieces of himself had been stolen by time? The dog nudged his leg with its nose, not forcefully but gently, insistently. Edward exhaled shakily. He couldn't stop here. Pushing himself up, he cast one last look at the carvings on the bench. Then, with a deep breath, he followed the dog once more. The journey wasn't over. Edward walked with the dog at his side, the wind biting at his exposed skin. The path ahead was unfamiliar, yet something deep inside him whispered that he had been here before. His feet crunched against the snow, but his mind was elsewhere, caught between past and present, between knowing and forgetting. The dog's presence was steady, unwavering. It trotted ahead but always looked back, as if ensuring he was still following, not just guiding, but protecting. A house came into view. Edward's breath caught in his throat. It was a modest home, nestled among leafless trees. Snow covered the roof and lined the wooden steps leading to the front door. The paint was chipped, the windows dark, yet something about it sent a jolt of recognition through his body. His pulse quickened. He knew this place. The dog stopped at the foot of the steps and turned, watching him expectantly. Edward's feet felt like they had turned to stone. He wanted to move, to climb those stairs, but a fear unlike anything he had ever known gripped him. What if there was nothing waiting inside? What if his mind was playing tricks on him again? The dog whined softly. Edward clenched his fists. He had to know. With slow, deliberate steps, he ascended the stairs. His gloved hand hovered over the doorknob before finally turning it. The door creaked open. A rush of warm air met his frozen face. The scent of aged wood, faintly mixed with something floral, lingered in the air. His heart pounded as he stepped inside. The house was empty, yet full of ghosts. Furniture covered in white sheets stood like forgotten relics. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the dim light filtering through the curtains. The wooden floors creaked beneath his weight. He moved further in, his breath unsteady. Every step brought a flicker of something, a voice, a touch, a fleeting glimpse of a life that felt both distant and achingly familiar. His fingers brushed over a framed photograph on a side table. He lifted it with trembling hands, wiping away the dust with his sleeve. And then he saw her. A young woman with a radiant smile, eyes full of life. Standing beside her was a younger version of himself, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, their happiness frozen in time. His chest tightened. He knew this woman. Her name fought to break through the fog of his mind, clawing its way back to him. The German shepherd let out a soft bark. Edward turned, looking at the dog with wide eyes, and suddenly it all came rushing back. He staggered, gripping the back of a chair for support. This was their home, his and her home. The memories flooded in, late nights by the fireplace, Sunday mornings filled with laughter, the way she would curl up next to him with a book, her fingers lazily running through his hair. And then the painful realization, she was gone. His knees gave out and he sank onto the chair. A sharp ache settled in his chest, a grief so deep it threatened to consume him. He had lost her once, but now he was losing her all over again. The dog padded closer and rested its head on his knee. Edward swallowed hard, his fingers running through the shepherd's fur. The warmth of the animal grounded him, pulling him back from the abyss of despair. Through blurred vision, he looked at the dog, truly seeing it for the first time. This wasn't just any dog. His breath hitched as he reached forward, cupping the animal's face gently. His voice was barely a whisper. "Max!" The dog's ears perked up. A sob broke free from Edward's throat. It was him, Max, their dog, her dog. The one that had been with them for years, the one that had disappeared the night she passed. Edward gripped Max's fur, pressing his forehead against the shepherd's. Tears slipped down his weathered cheeks, melting into the thick coat of the dog who had somehow, impossibly, found his way back. He had been lost for so long. But Max had brought him home. Edward exhaled shakily, gripping the dog tightly. He wasn't alone anymore. Edward sat in the silence of the house, his hand resting on Max's head. His fingers ran absently through the shepherd's thick fur, the warmth grounding him in a reality that felt both foreign and familiar. His chest was heavy, filled with the weight of memories rushing back all at once. The walls around him had witnessed decades of love, laughter, and now loneliness. The house had been abandoned, yet it remained untouched, as if it had been waiting for him to return. Max sat patiently at his feet, his deep brown eyes never leaving Edward's face. The dog had aged, his muzzle now peppered with grey, but the loyalty in his gaze was the same. Edward wiped his face with a trembling hand. How had he forgotten all of this? The answer was painful. Alzheimer's had stolen from him in ways no thief ever could. It had erased moments, fractured his identity, turned his past into a puzzle with missing pieces. He had woken up in a world that felt unfamiliar, not realizing that it was his own life that had become unrecognizable. But Max hadn't forgotten. The realization made Edward's throat tighten. The dog had found him, guided him, brought him back home. He struggled to his feet, his body stiff from the cold. Slowly, he moved through the house, his fingers trailing over old furniture covered in dust. Everything was just as he had left it. A quilt draped over the couch, a porcelain teacup on the side table, the scent of aged wood mixed with something floral, her scent. He swallowed the lump in his throat. His steps took him down the hallway, where the door to their bedroom stood slightly ajar. He hesitated before pushing it open. The room was frozen in time. The bed was neatly made, a book resting on the nightstand, its pages slightly curled with age. A framed photo stood beside it, her smile captured forever. Edward stepped closer, his breath unsteady. He picked up the photo, his thumb running over the glass as if touching her face. He could almost hear her voice, the soft way she used to say his name, the laughter that once filled these walls. His vision blurred. He had spent years grieving her loss, yet standing here now, it felt as if she had never truly left. A quiet whimper pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to find Max standing at the doorway, watching him. Edward managed a small, broken smile. "You never gave up, did you?" The dog's tail wagged gently, his ears perking up at the familiar voice. Edward sat on the edge of the bed, the exhaustion from the day settling deep into his bones. He was tired, not just physically, but in a way that went beyond the body, tired of feeling lost, tired of forgetting. Max moved closer, pressing his warm body against Edward's leg. For the first time in a long time, Edward didn't feel afraid. He remembered not everything, not every detail, but enough. Enough to know that this place was his home, that he had loved and been loved in return, that even if the disease took more from him, some things would always remain. Max curled up beside him, resting his head on Edward's lap. Edward exhaled deeply, running his hand through the dog's fur. The warmth of his companion, the silence of the house, it was comforting. He wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Like, subscribe and comment, help me grow.